Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey, my Hellions. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and as always, it's an honor and a privilege to speak with you today about the history and enduring legacy of the war in Vietnam. As of this recording, it is February 8th, 2025. It's a gray, cold, windy, overcast day here in Colorado Springs, but that's the perfect kind of day for doing chores around the house, doing some reading, and I'm hoping today I can get most of this episode recorded. Before we get started, I just want to make an announcement that this podcast is now available on YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Good Pods, Amazon Music, and Audible. Furthermore, if you want to ask me a question or shoot me a comment, you can find me at X. My handle is at greenhell6969. You can also find me on Facebook, Green Hell Podcast, or you can shoot me an email, 7thstanza@proton.me. So like I've mentioned in the past episodes, I'm working with a new setup. I'm recording on the Samsung Q9U, which I gotta be honest, it's making me a little pissed. If I'm too close to it, it starts adding all this weird extra clicks and stuff. I don't know what to describe it as. You'll probably hear it. If you do, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure it out. There may be nothing that can be done, but alas, it is what it is. Last night was my cousin's birthday. Happy birthday to him. I may sound a little drained. It's because perhaps I over-imbibed, but it was a good time. We were at this piano bar in Colorado Springs called Louie Louie's. If you're ever in town, highly recommended. They put on a great show. They did not sing my song, those bastards, but for those who know, Hair of the Dog by Nazareth, that's what I requested. I think it would have been a pretty sick song to sing together, but whatever. Anyway, we're getting back to the timeline, and we're going to pick up where we left off, which was Operation Lea. Quick recap, Operation Lea lasted from October 7, 1947 to November 8, 1947, and involved a 15,000-man operation to close with and destroy the Viet Minh. The idea was you send in a paratroop battalion to drop on the holdout where Ho Chi Minh and his entourage were hanging out, capture, kill them, rescue a couple hundred hostages, and then two other elements, one riverborne and one mechanized, would basically utilize a classical pincer movement to ensnare the Viet Minh, pin them down, and crush them. It's what's known as a set-piece battle. It's conventional warfare, the idea being you outflank the enemy, you box them in, and then they, having nowhere to go, are forced to stand and fight. You, being the superior military force, then just exhaust them until they quit, or until you've just annihilated them completely. That was the idea, that was the hope. However, as it turns out, that doesn't really work out so well when you're a force operating in dense jungle areas with lots of mountains. So as the French tried to pincer in and crush the Viet Minh, they were able to escape through the French lines, and that was the modus operandi for the Viet Minh. Escape and evade, reconsolidate, reorganize, and prepare for follow-on activities. So Operation Lea ultimately was not a success. Ho Chi Minh and his entourage escaped just in the nick of time, largely due to a sophisticated intelligence network that they had. Somebody was able to inform them ahead of time, and they didn't have a whole lot of notice, we know, but they did escape. However, the French liberated some 200 hostages that the Viet Minh took with them when they were escaping from Hanoi, when the French took back Hanoi, or rather obliterated Hanoi. However, what we find now is that the French are ready to try again only a few days later. On November 20th, 1947, the French engage in another operation called Operation Ceinture. All right, so quick edit. I just looked up how to pronounce that word, and it's actually ceinture, not ceinture, but ceinture. Whatever. I don't speak French, but what it means is belt. So that should speak volumes about the premise of the operation, right? Operation Belt. You're going to try to encircle the Viet Minh and crush them. And so that's what they were going to do. In a quadrangle-shaped region known as Viet Bac, it's in northwest Vietnam. It's basically a region that's north of Hanoi and up to the Chinese-Vietnam border. The premise was we're going to sweep through again, and we're going to box in the fleeing Viet Minh who presumably now are even more rocked on their heels after Operation Lea, and we're going to kill them. So the French Expeditionary Corps does just that. They sweep through and they tout a 9,500 KIA figure. However, as Bernard B. Fall notes in his book Street Without Joy, it's highly likely that that 9,500 casualty figure, or KIA figure, I should say, is inflated with the bodies of civilians that were caught in the crossfire or otherwise massacred by the French. We already know that the French had the capacity to be extremely brutal. They're looking for the Viet Minh. It's highly likely that they just swept through villages and massacred anybody and everybody that they thought may have associations with the Viet Minh. But that shouldn't really come as much of a surprise given what we know about how brutal the French could be, especially if you'll recall the Mai Trac and Mai Thuy massacres. So anyway, after Operation Santour, the French did succeed in gaining a vast jungle real estate, but it was too unwieldy, too large, and too dense to patrol. So they ultimately had to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate their strategy. They did indeed reevaluate their strategy. The Viet Minh also had to go back to the drawing board. Well, maybe not the drawing board per se, because they already had a pretty good formula to follow, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the Viet Minh had to continually adapt and improvise and overcome based on the conditions that they were facing. And so in today's episode, we're really going to be focusing kind of more on the conditions that the Viet Minh were facing, the new strategy that the French was employing, and the differences that were occurring during the years 1948 up through 1949 in both the North and the South. So let's talk about the French first. Okay, so after realizing that, one, they don't have the manpower, the logistics, or the supplies to patrol through and effectively control such a large region after Operation Santour, they decide what the best course of action is to pull back the majority of forces to the urban zones, consolidate control over the urban zones and the rice fields on the outskirts of these urban zones, thereby consolidating their control over the food supply and also maintaining the status quo when it comes to their colonial export industry. So the French were trying to keep the market open and keep the money flowing. That's the whole point of having a colony, is to utilize it for its resources and to allow it to benefit your national economy. And so after World War II, the French had a real vested interest in maintaining control over their colony, which, just a quick reminder, was not just Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia, okay? So if you were to look at a map of control, which there is a map in Christopher Gash's The Road to Dien Bien Phu, the early days of the war, basically the French had control of Saigon and the major port cities in central Vietnam, as well as the major port city of Haiphong, and also the big city of Hanoi. So they control these urban regions, and they are maintaining a capitalist system whereby the main currency is the French Indochina piastre, okay? Now, the DRV, alternatively, have spun up their own currency, and that currency is called the dong, and it's got Ho Chi Minh's face on it, which actually what it was French piastres that were reprinted with Ho Chi Minh's face over whatever face was previously on the French piastre. And it was the official currency of the DRV. So as you can imagine, right, the DRV's currency did not have the same value in relation to the French piastre. That is, you're going to do business, you're going to want to do business and get paid in the French piastre and not the Vietnamese dong. So we'll get into the economics of it in just a second, but it's important to note that the French strategy is in maintaining business and keeping the urban centers under their control for the specific purpose of maintaining control over economic viability of their colonial asset, which I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, it'll make more sense when we start talking about the economics of it. Anyway, so here's what their thought process is. They think, well, we don't have enough people to patrol through the vast jungle mountain region and eliminate the Viet Minh. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leave a chain of border forts on the China-Vietnam border. And then we're going to pull the main bulk of our forces into the urban zones and control the rice paddies on the outskirts of these urban zones. And we're going to maintain the status quo as best as possible, while also using subterfuge, espionage, and other tactics to try and sway the people at the edges of their control, right? On those overlap regions where DRV and French are vying for control, and sway them to not join the DRV. It really is as simple as that. Degrade the DRV's ability to recruit and maintain its resistance against French colonialism. That's the primary objective of the French. And the primary objective of the Viet Minh is simple, even simpler perhaps, and that is bog down the French, disperse their forces, deteriorate their morale, and turn French public opinion against the war, and convince the French public that Vietnam's independence is the only solution and that it cannot be any other way. Now, what's really intriguing about this whole period, the early war period, is not what their goals were, but how they go about executing. Okay, drilling down on French military strategy, specifically in the north. Okay, so as previously mentioned, there is a series of border forts on the China-Vietnam border. Some 300 miles to the southeast is where the French have pulled back the bulk of their forces. That is Hanoi, Haiphong, and some villages in between, right? Now, there's a main transport route called Route Coloniale 4, also known as National Route 4, and for the sake of this, we're going to call it RC4. It was a critical artery during this time because it connected Hanoi to the Chinese border forts. So if your goal is to project the perception that you've got control, right? You've got these forts on the border, you've got these forts along this route to show that France is in control. We've got a presence here, and we've got a presence, and we're going to secure the urban zones, and we're going to secure the main transport routes. And in order to secure our border forts, we need a supply line. It's simple. It's that simple. There's one big problem, and that is that RC4 traversed through rugged mountainous terrain in this dense mountain region of Vietnam. The area was covered with super dense jungles, which provided cover for the Viet Minh to infiltrate and exfiltrate, to target these out in the open, disconnected forts all along this route and also all along the border. It was a simple case of you've got a bunch of targets, you can't defend all of them, you're gonna plus up resources to attack one, and then you're gonna fall back, and you're gonna hopefully just disperse the enemy, i.e. the French forces, so that they can't be effective. And also, you're gonna drain them economically, and you're gonna drain them militarily. And the other problem was that a lot of times this route would go through narrow paths and steep gradients, which made it difficult for the French to maneuver their heavy equipment and their long supply convoys. And there was also a terrain/climate issue. In the monsoon season, this road would become muddy as hell and nearly impassable for troops to get through there without getting stuck in the mud. And during the dry season, the route became dusty as hell and made it really hard to see anything because there's so much dust, and it's really hard to be on the lookout for a Viet Minh ambush when there's dust everywhere and you can't see anything. So the Viet Minh used this terrain to their advantage, and they would just ambush this shit out of French convoys at the natural choke points that occurred on this road. That meant maintaining supply lines was a nightmare. The Viet Minh would cut these supply lines, and they would also sabotage infrastructure where they could. That is, blow up bridges, cut down trees in the middle of roads, crater roads, do whatever they could to make it so that these supply lines couldn't connect Hanoi to the border region, and so that you couldn't continuously reinforce the border forts and you couldn't continuously pass supplies to and fro to maintain your presence. The Viet Minh, in a lot of cases, could pick off these outposts one by one, knowing that reinforcements probably wouldn't arrive in time because, the lines are stretched so thin. And the Viet Minh had another advantage. They had a more reliable intelligence network. Local militia groups were able to gather intelligence on French movements, whereas the French struggled to gather intelligence on the Viet Minh activities because they're shadows in the jungle way off in the remote regions where the French didn't have control and didn't have the same intelligence networks as they had in the cities. And this is going to become a huge theme for the entirety of the war. So much so that if you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, great movie. We're gonna get to that battle later on down the road. But the very opening scene is a French convoy getting ambushed. I mean, it encapsulates the essence of the French's problem, and that is they just could not maintain the supply chains that they needed, and they were regular targets for the enemy. A lot of times the French would have to utilize supply drops in lieu of supply convoys, but supply drops are inherently less effective and also way more costly. However, all things considered, it really seems like both the Viet Minh and French strategies were as good as they could have been given the constraints. The DRV really lacked funding and resources at this point, and the French really lacked the manpower to effectively control the territory that they sought to control. So both groups kind of had to rely on asymmetric warfare to supplement their conventional strategies. Let's switch gears and talk about the Viet Minh for a second. The Viet Minh had one real big problem on their hands, and that problem is how do we maintain and gain momentum in mobilizing the resistance against the French efforts to not only crush us physically, that is, actually literally kill us all, but also crush our political movement. So the Viet Minh intensified their political efforts and focused on recruiting and mobilizing the rural base. And this makes a lot of sense because if you will recall the Battle of Hanoi, the government was displaced from the urban areas and they had no choice but to flee out into the rural areas. And this created a kind of cultural exchange between the Vietnamese urbanites who were patriotic and nationalist and also now had no homes because the French had displaced them, and now they were living in the rural areas with the peasants. And a lot of times these people had never ever interfaced. The peasants lived out and picked rice and farmed, worked their asses off, and were uneducated, illiterate, and the fruits of their labor were sold in these economic zones that were populated by literate, cultured Vietnamese who were operating in the colonial economy. 90% of the Vietnamese population, the heart and soul of the nation, were these peasants that were working in unbelievable conditions and starving very often or dying of malnutrition for the sake of producing exports that were then sold on the colonial market. Sometimes this was even a disturbing culture shock. There's one anecdote that Christopher Goster writes, and I'll just briefly quote that. He says, quote, "For the patriotic daughter of a Hui Mandarin, it was too much. As she confided to a friend in a resistance area located 50 kilometers from the ancient capital, quote, I can't stand seeing the peasants living like this anymore. I'm going to return to the city. I beg you to come with me," end quote. She returned. Her friend and confidant, Xuan Huang, carried on. And I only bring this little anecdotal story up because it's amusing to me to think that it's like, even in Vietnam, there was like this naive, privileged class of rich coastal elites that had never even confronted the realities of the other 90% of their fellow citizens. And when they did, the truth was too brutal and ugly for them, and they wanted to flee back to the comfort of their urban lives. So, anyway. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that unlike the French, the DRV really relied heavily on the labor and the fruits of the labor provided by the peasants. The French, on the other hand, were supplied by outside sources like the United States, and therefore didn't have any particular incentive in winning over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people in the rural areas, nor preserving their livelihoods. That is, their rice fields, their salt mines, their livestock, etc., etc. For example, in 1948, French commandos raided and destroyed 2,500 tons of enemy salt stores. The French were also not above slaughtering livestock, sabotaging dikes to flood rice fields, and other acts of sabotage and destruction that would hinder or otherwise degrade the DRV's access to food supply to feed the troops, to feed the people, and to feed the government civil servants. For their part, the Viet Minh would often attack French rubber plantations and intimidate the workers, as well as ambush rubber convoys, because the rubber was used in the production of latex, which was then sold on the international market for US dollars. And those US dollars were very important for the French economy. And so the Viet Minh were likewise doing anything they could to otherwise degrade or erode the French economic value. But the interesting thing here is that the Viet Minh really relied on French colonialism to fund their war effort. And so this is where it gets wacky. There was kind of a fine line that the Viet Minh would not cross in their efforts to degrade French colonial economic activity. Why? Because the French colonial economic activity generated French Indochinese piastres. It was a currency that was worth way more than the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's official currency, the dong. The dong was a hyperinflated banknote, but they forced the people in the DRV control to only use the dong. And while they were forcing the people to use the dong, the government itself was creating a stockpile reserve of French Indochinese piastres that would be used to finance exports on the international market. So to fund the resistance effort, they needed to buy things from other countries. Well, other countries aren't going to sell things to the DRV if they're going to get the dong. I mean, they're going to sell shit to the DRV if they're going to get French Indochinese piastres. And the government of the DRV knew that, so what they would do is they would kind of launder the dong to get Indochinese piastres. And I'll explain how they did it. So here's what they would do. In zones that were rice poor, meaning they, for whatever reason, weren't producing a lot of rice, maybe they just didn't have the climate for rice, or maybe they were having a bad season. Who knows? Doesn't matter. They would send their DRV banknotes to the areas that had a lot of rice, okay? The zones that were DRV controlled that had a lot of rice, they would get this influx of the dong, and they would buy the rice with the dong from these other zones, and then they would sell that rice to the Chinese, to Chinese intermediaries. Those Chinese intermediaries would sell this excess rice on the international market for French Indochinese piastres. Because of the exchange rate, the Chinese intermediaries are making a nice profit for their part in the transaction, and then they would take their cut, and then they would give those French Indochinese piastres that they made for that sale to the DRV, and the DRV would stockpile it and use those piastres to finance imports from abroad. And some of the imports from abroad were coming from the Philippines, Thailand, and also China. A lot of this economic activity was facilitated by Viet Minh spies. These spies were people who had long-standing communist contacts in China, Thailand, and other places where the Communist International Organization that was spun up and funded by the Soviet Union had been long working since the 20s to create networks of communists. So when the actually hits the fan, all these communists activated their old ties to their other commie friends abroad to help facilitate this international supply chain. The French, for their part, were pretty crafty. They were very well aware that all of this was going on. And so what they would do is they would use either captured dong or counterfeit dong, and they would launder them into selected local economies, strategically chosen local economies, to inflate the number of dong in circulation in that area and thereby devalue the dong. This created a situation where sometimes people would have to carry backpacks worth of dong just to buy food. And the idea was, hey, if you're living in one of these areas and you're on the fence about supporting the DRV, and now you see that the DRV dong is worth almost nothing and you have to carry around backpacks worth of it just to buy food, you might consider realigning with the French because the French piastre is way stronger. Basic economics, basic incentives. Okay, so now I want to talk about the posture of the Viet Minh regular army. About this time, there was approximately 100,000 men. 60,000 of those men were in the northern half of the country, and 40,000 were operating in the south. They were organized in regiments, but that was the highest level of organization. Normally, above a regiment is a division-sized element, and they didn't have those yet. Local commanders were starting to learn from battlefield experience, and they were improving their combat effectiveness of their army. This included being able to receive, analyze, and apply intelligence reports into their planning process. This also involved being able to effectively respond to intelligence about French military operations. And the other part of this is being able to coordinate with themselves. In addition to the regular army, there was two types of supplemental forces. One was the village militias. These militias were primarily tasked with protecting villages and providing the regular troops that were passing through with food, salt, water, as well as taking in and caring for their wounded troops, and also providing volunteers. And those volunteers might do any number of tasks, but they could also be used just to supplement the regular army. And then you had another group of volunteers that supplemented the regular army, and these were regional troops. They were kind of like the National Guard. They were like semi-regular. They operated within like specific administrative zones. They were better equipped than the militias, but they still weren't as good as the regular troops. They were partisans that were motivated by the idea of nationalism. They weren't necessarily communists, but they definitely were against the French. And they primarily would only focus on hit and run tactics and avoided direct confrontations with the French because they were certainly not as technologically or professionally equipped as the French were. Sometimes they would be used as like kind of a QRF to come to the aid of regular soldiers if those regular soldiers were being overrun or at great risk of being annihilated by the French. Okay, so all this that I've just described was churning through 1946, 1947, and then things start to change in 1948. And there's kind of a crazy twist that you just can't make up, but it seems like this is going to come straight out of a soap opera, okay? And here's what it was. France sought to counter Viet Minh influence by supporting the creation of an alternative Vietnamese state. And who do they bring in? None other than former Emperor Bao Dai. That's right, interstage left. Emperor Bao Dai, the very one who abdicated the throne and handed his support to Ho Chi Minh when Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945. Apparently, Bao Dai had a falling out, and it was largely rooted in the Viet Minh's communist ideology. Ever since 1947, Bao Dai had been engaging in secret discussions with non-communist nationalist groups, and he saw for himself an opportunity to re-enter the scene and perhaps change the trajectory of Vietnam to an independent one that was not communist. All through 1948, Bao Dai and the French engaged in negotiations to iron out the specifics of what a Bao Dai-led government would look like and what role it would have and what relationship it would have with the French Empire. So the United States finally starts to nudge Bao Dai to sign an agreement in January 1949. The United States was seeing the writing on the wall that was going down in China because they realized that the Chinese communists were gaining a large advantage over Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang nationalist forces. Seeing what was on the horizon, they nudged Bao Dai to sign an agreement, and he signed an agreement on 8 March 1949. This agreement goes down in the history books as the Elysee Accords, and it was a treaty that recognized independence of Vietnam from France as an associated member within the French Union. The main provisions of this accord were that Vietnam would be recognized as an associated state within the French Union, meaning it would have its own government, but it would have significant French supervision. The agreement united the 3 regions of Vietnam, that is, Cochin China in the south, Annam in the central part, and Tonkin in the north, into one state, reversing the separate administrative status they had under French colonialism. This was intended to give the appearance of a more cohesive Vietnamese state under Bao Dai. Bao Dai was the recognized head of state, and this government would also have a prime minister who would essentially run the government, although Bao Dai was kind of just considered more of a figurehead, more of a ceremonial role. France would still retain control over military aspects, including defense policy, the organization of the Vietnamese military, as well as foreign military relations. As far as foreign affairs go, Vietnam's foreign policy was to be conducted in coordination with France, basically giving France veto power over international relations. And France also had financial control over currency and customs. As you very well may imagine, there were strong provisions within this agreement that would reinforce the economic and cultural ties that Vietnam would have with the French Empire. This agreement also granted Vietnam its own legislative, judicial, and administrative systems, but these systems were, again, subject to French oversight to ensure that they aligned with French policy. As far as territorial integrity goes, the agreement acknowledged Vietnam's territorial integrity, but only within the context of the French Union, meaning that any significant territorial changes would require French approval. There was an implicit promise of a path towards greater independence, but this was contingent on France's assessment of Vietnam's readiness and the stability of the region. Emperor Bao Dai seemed to think that he could get the full autonomy of Vietnam. However, as history shows, this was never to be the case. A lot of people in Vietnam, a lot of the citizens of Vietnam, I should say, really saw the associated state of Vietnam as just being a puppet government of France. Emperor Bao Dai's associated state of Vietnam officially comes into being on June 14th, 1949. A few months later, in October 1949, the Chinese Communist Party would win the Chinese Civil War, and that would prove a very significant inflection point in the course of this long and brutal war. Up until then, the DRV was kind of doing what it could to survive. It wasn't really thriving. It was subsisting. It was relying heavily on guerrilla warfare and avoiding direct confrontations with the French army. But all that's about to change. And I'm really excited for the next set of episodes because we're going to go deep into the on-the-ground accounts of pitched battle. We're going to talk about the transition from guerrilla warfare to what's known as the general counteroffensive. And there's going to be a lot more significant battle scenes that when I was reading about them in Bernard B. Fall's Street Without Joy, I was blown away. So I'm excited to share all that with you. Strap in and look forward to the next episode. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in. Special shout out to all you fans out there, and special shout out to the folk over at www.zapsplat.com. As always, be brave, be badass, be bold. Talk to you later.